Hey friends, welcome to One Thing, our weekly video blog at Prince of Peace Lutheran Church in Burnsville, Minnesota. I'm Jeff Marian, one of the pastors on staff, and I'm really glad that you joined me today. Today I want to talk about your heart. I'm not talking about the blood pumping organ in your chest and in mine. I'm really talking about the seat of emotion within us. And in particular, I want to talk about the wisdom of your heart. The part that our hearts can play in our development as human beings and as followers of Jesus Christ. I want to explore what our hearts can teach us if we're willing to listen. Now, for reasons that I don't fully understand, I grew up having kind of a long-distance relationship with my emotions, my feelings. I mean, we'd have occasional conversations, but I didn't want to get terribly close with my feelings, and so we didn't really know each other terribly well. Truth is, most of my life, I could tell you when I was feeling something, but I couldn't necessarily tell you what it was that I was feeling unless I was happy, sad, or ticked off. And in fact, for a while, I used what's called an emotion or feeling wheel to help me to identify what I was feeling. If you're not familiar with an emotion wheel, you can think of it as kind of a color chart for emotions. For instance, on a color chart, you just don't have blue. You have navy blue, midnight blue, indigo blue, powder blue, cobalt, and on and on. And on a feeling or emotion wheel, you just don't have anger. You have betrayed, resentful, disrespected, rage, furious, volatile, violated, and on and on. And it was helpful to teach me how to more accurately name my emotions, but the truth is I had always preferred to ignore them. I sometimes wonder if that isn't a part of the reason that I was actually drawn to Lutheranism as a young adult. I mean, we Lutherans, in general, we tend to be heady people. And that's part of our history. I mean, Martin Luther engendered a well-educated Christian tradition. As Lutherans, we often don't know how we feel about Jesus, but by golly, we can recite to you Luther's explanation to the Second Creed or article of the Creed, and this is most certainly true. Luther insisted that the Bible, not our feelings or our experiences, were the sole source of truth when it came to matters of faith, and so feelings didn't matter. I often wonder if it wasn't just Luther's influence that made us a rather unemotional faith tradition, but Lutheranism also flourished in the cold Scandinavian climates, people who were stuck indoors with one another for months and months at a time. And if they started expressing feelings, somebody might just get hurt. And so I found Lutherans to be a pretty intellectual but unemotional bunch, which suited me just fine. Books I could read. My heart, not so much. It was a match made in heaven. Any denomination that calls passive-aggressive behavior a spiritual gift is my kind of religion. Even the Bible seemed to teach that feelings were bad and that the heart couldn't be trusted. In my college days, I attended some pretty conservative churches, and a verse that was often quoted was Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9. That's usually translated something like this: "The human heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it?" The Message translation says this: "The heart is hopelessly dark and deceitful, a puzzle that no one can figure out." Seems pretty clear, right? My heart can't be trusted. My feelings will deceive me. They actually stand against God, which means that they're sinful and dangerous. The faithful thing to do would be to ignore them, right? But then I began to do a little digging into the original Hebrew of that verse, and what I found surprised me. So buckle up for a moment and indulge me while I spend a little time talking about some ancient Hebrew. The Hebrew word that in Jeremiah is translated deceitful is akov. It's the root of the biblical name Jacob, a name that means to grab the heel, which Jacob did to his brother Esau at the time of their birth. And because of Jacob and his story in Genesis, people often think that the word akov automatically means to deceive, because Jacob did a lot of deceiving. His name is sometimes translated the deceiver. And so most biblical translations translate akov as deceitful. But akov literally just means heel, as in the back of your foot. And in fact, the Septuagint, which is the earliest Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, completed around the 2nd century, used the Greek word bathuno when translating akov. And rather than meaning something willfully concealed and deceptive, bathuno carries the meaning of deep things that may seem hidden because they run deep. It was often the word that was used to describe the depth of the sea. Our early church mothers and fathers took the word in Hebrew akov and understood it not to mean deception, but to mean deep knowledge that we cannot comprehend, that we have to dig out as if mining deep in a mountain for gold. And if we look at the word in that verse from Jeremiah in its context, that makes sense. The heart is deep above all things. And especially when you compare it with its outro, who can know it? So this verse doesn't mean that the heart is deceptive and that our hearts lie to us so that our feelings can't be trusted. It means that our hearts are deep like the ocean. And to understand the wisdom of our hearts, we need to probe below the surface. Now that verse from Jeremiah also says that the heart is desperately wicked in many translations. But again, we have to dive into the ancient Hebrew. And we find that that isn't the best translation. The Hebrew word anesh, which is translated here as deceptively wicked, really means mankind in a state of weakness and helplessness. Or the word that we might use in English is vulnerable. Open to give and receive love, but also open to being easily wounded. And so our hearts aren't evil. There is instead a wisdom that dwells in our hearts, a wisdom that dwells deep within, a wisdom worth probing if we dare to feel our feelings and ask, what are my feelings saying? And that, I am finding, is the growth question. What are my feelings saying? But let me be more specific. When I'm feeling angry, the question, what are my feelings saying about that awful person who's making me angry, isn't helpful. That question doesn't lead to growth, it leads to judgment. Now, the growth question really is, what are my feelings saying about me? What are my feelings saying about what's really happening inside of me? Our hearts, our feelings, are always inviting us to understand ourselves more fully, to see the deeper truths of who we really are. In other words, our hearts and our feelings are made for self-revelation, for deeper self-understanding. Let me give you a simple example from my own life. I love to travel, but I began to notice an emotional pattern in my life. Every morning before we would leave for a trip, I'd be crabby. Little things that my wife Nancy would say or do irritated me. And I tried to ignore those feelings, but that only made me crabbier, which is what happens when we try and bury hard emotions. In my immaturity, I blamed Nancy for my irritation, even though I knew deep down it wasn't about her. In fact, it wasn't until I sat with the question, what are my feelings saying about me? What's going on deep inside of me? That things began to change. It took some serious digging because remember, our hearts are deep. But what I found is that I have a low-level anxiety about places I haven't been before. Now, I won't bore you with where I think that comes from, but without being consciously aware of it, I was wrestling with a certain sense of fear whenever we got ready to travel someplace new, someplace I hadn't been. And I kept telling myself that I should be excited to travel, and I was, but my heart was telling me something different. And when the wisdom of my heart became apparent to me, when my fear was brought into the light, everything changed. Now when I get ready to travel and I feel crabbiness beginning to well up, rather than blaming Nancy or burying those feelings, I stop and I remind myself, oh yeah, I know what that's about. I have nothing to worry about. I'm competent to travel, and God will go with me wherever I go. You see how that works? Ignoring my feelings only intensified them. Blaming my feelings on others only keeps me stuck. But embracing my feelings, trusting their wisdom, asking, what are my feelings saying about me? What are they trying to teach me? That opens me up to growth and to learning. And I've been amazed at how often my heart knows things that my head does not. Things that have been hidden from me and things that I need to know in order to grow. Now, sometimes this work of probing the depths of our hearts is work that we can do on our own. Sometimes it requires a trusted friend or a skilled counselor. But it is also work that God is always willing and able to do alongside us. Psalm 139 says, God, I invite your searching gaze into my heart. Examine me through and through. Find out everything that may be hidden within me. This work of probing and listening to our hearts isn't easy, but God brings light and understanding if we're open to hearing the truth about ourselves. Now, if this is a topic that interests you, I can recommend a book that I'm just finishing called Untamed by Glennon Doyle. It's insightful, it's laugh out loud funny, it's challenging, it is sometimes irreverent, but it is so good. And it has so much to say about the depth of our feelings and our need for emotional intelligence. I want to close by reading a passage from this book out of a chapter called Deliveries. Glennon Doyle writes, I am a sensitive, introverted woman, which means that I love humanity, but actual human beings are tricky for me. I love people, but not in person. For example, I would die for you, but not meet you for coffee. I became a writer so that I could stay at home, alone in my pajamas, reading and writing about the importance of human connection and community. It's an almost perfect existence, except that every so often, while I'm thinking my thoughts, writing my words, living in my favorite spot, which is deep inside my own head, something stunning happens. A siren-like noise tears through my home. I freeze. It takes me a solid minute to understand. The siren is the doorbell. A person is ringing my doorbell. I run out of my office to find my children also stunned and frozen and waiting for direction about how to respond to this imminent home invasion. We stare at each other, count bodies, and collectively cycle through the 5 stages of doorbell grief. Number 1, denial. This can't be happening. All of the people allowed to be in this house are already in this house. Maybe it was a TV. Is the TV on? Stage number 2, anger. Who does this? What kind of boundaryless aggressor rings someone's doorbell in broad daylight? Stage number 3, bargaining. Don't move. Don't breathe. Maybe they'll go away. Stage 4, depression. Why? Why us? Why anyone? Why is life so hard? Stage 5, acceptance. Well, damn it. You, the little one, we volunteer you. Put on some pants, act normal, and answer the door. It's dramatic, but the door always gets answered. And if the kids aren't home, I'll even answer it myself. Is this because I remember that adulting requires door answering? Of course not. I answer the door because of the sliver of hope in my heart that if I open the door, there might be a package waiting for me, a surprise. When I got sober, I learned that hard feelings are doorbells that interrupt me, send me into a panic, and then leave me with an exciting package. Sobriety is a decision to stop numbing and blaming away hard feelings and start answering the door. So when I quit drinking, I began allowing my feelings to disturb me. This was scary because I had always assumed that my feelings were so big and powerful that they would stay forever and eventually kill me. But my hard feelings did not stay forever, and they did not kill me. Instead, they came and went, and afterward, I was left with something I didn't have before. A package. That something was called self-knowledge. So good. Friends, let me challenge you. Let me encourage you to explore the deep wisdom of your heart. Because our hearts were made with a wisdom that sometimes our head does not know. A wisdom that leads us to understand ourselves more and can even help us to be more faithful followers in the way of Jesus. Thanks so much for joining me. May God bless you on the journey of probing the deep, deep wisdom of our deep, deep heart.